My sister's text said, "Don't come to the rehearsal dinner. Ethan's dad is a federal judge. You'll embarrass me." I replied with one word, "Okay." But halfway through that dinner, when that same powerful man stood up and looked straight at me, calling me Your Honor in front of 75 stunned guests, I finally understood. She wasn't afraid I would embarrass her. She was terrified that everyone would finally see who I really was, and who she wasn't. My name is Rebecca Hayes, and this is the story of the night my sister's carefully constructed lies came crashing down. It started 3 hours before the dinner, in my chambers on the 14th floor of the Great Lakes District Federal Courthouse, with a phone vibrating against mahogany wood. The silence in my office wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that had weight and texture, built from thousands of pages of legal briefs, sentencing memorandums, and exhibits that covered every surface of my chambers. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the February sky was threatening freezing rain, the kind that turns an evening commute into a slow-motion disaster. But in here, the air was temperature-controlled, smelling faintly of old paper, lemon oil, and the sharp metallic scent of ozone from the laser printer in Andrew's outer office. I was reviewing a motion for summary judgment on an environmental class action suit that had been clogging my docket for 3 years. My highlighter, a specific shade of yellow I ordered in bulk, hovered over a paragraph where defense counsel had made a procedural error so subtle that 99% of readers would miss it. I didn't miss it. I never missed it. Finding what people tried to hide in the margins was my job. It had been my entire life. Then the phone vibrated. Not the standard long buzz of a spam call, not the rhythmic pulse of a colleague. 3 short, sharp jolts against the wood. Buzz, buzz, buzz. My hand stopped moving. The highlighter remained suspended in air. That pattern was a custom vibration I'd assigned 15 years ago to my sister Ashley. I'd never bothered to change it, even after months would pass without hearing from her. It was muscle memory now. That little spike of cortisol, the physical echo of a lifetime of crisis management and carefully orchestrated chaos. In my line of work, we're trained to control our autonomic responses. When a defendant screams in the courtroom, when a lawyer slams a fist on the table, when a witness breaks down in hysterics, I'm the anchor. I don't flinch. I don't gasp. I remain the calmest person in the room because the room requires a center of gravity. But when that phone buzzed 3 times, my chest tightened. I placed the highlighter down, aligning it perfectly parallel with the edge of the case file, a small ritual of control. Then I picked up the phone. The screen was bright against the dimming afternoon light, a single text message from Ashley. No greeting, no preamble. Ashley didn't believe in soft openings. "Don't come to rehearsal dinner tonight. Ethan's dad is a federal judge. You'll embarrass me. Don't make a scene." I read it once. Then I read it again. Most people, upon receiving a message like that from their only sister 2 days before her wedding, would feel something immediate: anger, hurt, the hot flush of rejection. I waited for those feelings, monitoring my own internal state like a technician watching gauges on a dashboard. But nothing happened. My pulse didn't quicken. My hands didn't shake. Instead, I felt something cold and crystalline settle over me. It was the same feeling I got when a prosecutor handed me evidence that irrefutably proved a defendant was lying. The feeling of a lock clicking into place. Ethan's dad is a federal judge. The sentence glowed in white pixels on the screen. The irony was so dense it had weight, like copper on the tongue. Ashley was worried about embarrassing herself in front of Judge Thomas Bradford. She'd spent the last 18 months obsessing over the Bradford family, their legal dynasty, their political connections, their country club memberships. To Ashley, marrying Ethan Bradford wasn't about love. It was about access, about finally being somebody. And in her carefully constructed narrative, I was the liability, the quiet sister who worked too much, wore suits that were too severe, drove a car that was too sensible. In her story, I was the relative who would use the wrong fork or say something awkward about municipal bonds in front of the aristocracy. She thought she was protecting her future. She thought she was building a firewall between her shiny new life and the dull, embarrassing reality of where we came from. She had no idea. I didn't type a response immediately. Instead, I pressed the buttons on the side of my phone and took a screenshot. The screen flashed white for a fraction of a second, capturing the cruelty forever. I opened my file manager and navigated to a folder I'd created 7 years ago, titled simply, Receipts. The folder wasn't new. It was populated with hundreds of files, screenshots of text messages where she'd asked for money, emails where she'd blamed me for her missed rent payments, photos from the time she sold our grandmother's jewelry and claimed it was stolen. It was a digital museum of my sister's character, archived and indexed with the same meticulous care I brought to case files. I added the new screenshot, watching the file count tick up by 1. Just another piece of evidence. Another exhibit for a trial that would probably never happen, because to have a trial, the other party has to care about the truth. A soft knock on the heavy oak door interrupted my thoughts. "Come in," I said, my voice steady, betraying nothing. The door opened and Andrew appeared, my 26-year-old law clerk, brilliant and possessed of organizational skills that made him indispensable. He was carrying a stack of leather-bound binders and a tablet, but his eyes went immediately to my face, scanning for signs of distress. He knew about the rehearsal dinner. He knew I'd cleared my docket this afternoon to prepare. "We need to review the scheduling order for the grand jury tomorrow morning," Andrew said, placing the binders on the far edge of my desk. "And Judge Miller called. He wants to know if you're still available to cover his arraignments next Tuesday." I nodded, my eyes moving from the phone back to the paperwork. "Tell Judge Miller I can take the arraignments, and file the scheduling order. I'll review it before I leave." Andrew paused. He didn't leave. His gaze drifted to an object on the corner of my desk, the one thing that didn't belong in a federal workspace. It was an envelope made of thick, cream-colored cardstock. It had been opened carefully with a letter opener, the wax seal broken cleanly. Beside it lay the invitation itself, letterpressed in gold ink. "The Bradford family requests the honor of your presence." It was addressed to me, not to Ashley's sister, not to occupant. To Judge Rebecca Hayes, with my work address listed below. "Are you heading out soon?" Andrew asked gently. "Traffic on the I-90 is backing up. If you're going to the dinner, you should probably leave within the hour." I picked up the invitation. The paper felt expensive between my thumb and forefinger, 80-pound stock at least. The typography was elegant, understated. This wasn't a pity invite. This had been sent directly from the Bradford family office. And that was the question, wasn't it? If Ashley was so terrified of me embarrassing her, why had the Bradfords ensured I received this invitation? The logic didn't hold. If Judge Thomas Bradford was the reason I was being banned, then Thomas Bradford wouldn't have put me on the guest list. A man like that controlled his lists with an iron fist. The math didn't add up, which meant Ashley was lying, not just to me, but to someone. She wasn't protecting the Bradfords from me. She was protecting herself from something, from the collision of two worlds she'd been keeping carefully separate. I looked at Andrew. "No," I said quietly. "I'm not going to the dinner." Andrew blinked, surprised. He knew I'd bought a new dress. He knew I'd rearranged my entire week around this event. "Oh, I'm sorry. Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I said. And strangely, I meant it. "In fact, things are clearer than they've been in years." Andrew nodded, sensing the dismissal, and left. When the door clicked shut, I looked back at my phone. The cursor was blinking in the reply field, waiting. I could have fought. I could have called her and demanded an explanation. I could have listed all the times I'd helped her, bailed her out, cleaned up her messes. But lawyers know that emotional outbursts aren't arguments. They're weaknesses. I typed, "You can rest easy. I won't embarrass you." I hit send. The message delivered instantly, the status changing from sent to read within 10 seconds. She was watching her phone, waiting for the fight. She wanted the drama. She wanted me to beg so she could have the satisfaction of saying no. By agreeing with her, by removing the conflict, I was depriving her of the narrative she wanted to spin. I set the phone face down on the desk. The invitation still sat there, gold ink catching the lamplight. Ethan's dad is a federal judge. I turned to my computer and opened my digital calendar. The evening block from 6 to 10 was marked Rehearsal Dinner, Ivory Terrace. I didn't delete it. Instead, I minimized it, keeping it on the record. Then I noticed a new email notification on my secure line. A confirmation for a meeting tonight, one I'd tentatively accepted earlier in the week, thinking I'd have to cancel it for wedding obligations. But now I was free. I opened the email. The sender was Judge Patricia Morgan, the woman who'd mentored me since I was a terrified first-year law student, the woman who'd taught me that the law didn't care if I was nice, only if I was right. Dinner confirmed. 7 p.m., the Capitol Grill. Looking forward to it. I checked the time. 5:15 p.m. I had plenty of time to finish the summary judgment, change into the clothes I'd brought, and make my way downtown. Ashley thought she'd uninvited me from the seat of power. She thought she'd banished me to the sidelines. She had no idea that she'd just freed me to walk into the one room where I actually belonged. I picked up my pen, uncapped it, and turned back to the legal brief. The world outside was cold and chaotic, but in here, everything was under control. "I'm not going to embarrass you, Ashley," I whispered to the empty room, "because embarrassment implies a mistake. And what's about to happen is not a mistake." A small pause, and then I added, quieter still, "It's a correction." Andrew had left a fresh pot of coffee in the outer office. I poured myself a cup, black, no sugar, and returned to my desk. But I couldn't focus on the brief anymore. The words blurred together, and my mind kept circling back to that text message, to the years of accumulated slights that had led to this moment. To understand why I didn't cry when my sister told me I wasn't welcome at her wedding rehearsal, you have to understand the architecture of my family. In every house, there's a certain distribution of light. In ours, the spotlight was fixed permanently, unmovably, on Ashley. I wasn't the villain in our family story. I was simply the stagehand, the person who moved props in the dark so Ashley could have her next scene. We grew up in a mid-sized house in the suburbs where appearances meant everything and substance was negotiable. From the time we were small, the roles were assigned with biological determinism. Ashley was the golden child, blonde, effervescent, loud. She demanded attention the way a fire demands oxygen, consuming everything in the room until there was nothing left for anyone else. I was the spare, dark-haired, quiet, observant. My parents called me easy, which is the word lazy parents use for a child they don't have to parent. The disparity was never subtle. It was financial, emotional, and logistical. When Ashley wanted competitive dance lessons that cost $3,000 a year, my father worked overtime and my mother clipped coupons. They made it happen because Ashley's happiness was the family's primary objective. When I wanted to join the debate team, which required a fee of $200 for the entire season, I was told that things were tight and I needed to be considerate of the family budget. I didn't argue. I was 12 years old. I mowed lawns that summer, babysat the neighbors' unruly toddlers, saved every crumpled $5 bill in a shoebox under my bed. By September, I had the money. I remember walking into the kitchen and placing those bills on the counter in front of my mother. She'd looked at them, then at me, and something had flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe? Or discomfort. She didn't say, "I'm proud of you." She said, "Well, don't lose it." That was the pattern. Ashley was given. I earned. Ashley was invested in. I was maintained. They told everyone that Ashley had spirit, that she was going to be a star. She bounced from interest to interest, leaving a trail of expensive equipment in her wake. There was the violin phase, the horseback riding phase, the modeling phase. Each new hobby was greeted with fresh applause and a fresh check. Meanwhile, I kept my head down. I got straight A's, not because I wanted their praise, but because I'd calculated early on that grades were the only currency that could buy my way out of that house. I was 8 years old when I won the Regional Academic Excellence Award for my essay on the judicial branch. It came with a trophy and a small ceremony at the district office. My teacher had called my parents to tell them about it, had given them the date and time. The day of the ceremony, I wore my best dress, a hand-me-down from Ashley that was too big in the shoulders. I kept looking at the door of the auditorium, waiting for them to walk in. They never came. When I got home that evening, trophy in hand, I found them in the living room watching a video recording of Ashley's dance recital from the week before. My mother was crying with pride. My father had his arm around her. "Where were you?" I'd asked, holding up the trophy. My mother had looked at me, genuinely confused. "Oh, honey, that was today? We thought it was next week. Ashley's recital ran long and we were just so exhausted." The trophy went on a shelf in my room. A week later, I found it in the trash. No one ever mentioned it again. That was when I learned. If I shared my victories, they'd be diminished or discarded. So I stopped sharing. The scholarship letters to college arrived when I was 17. Full ride to 3 different universities, academic merit, forensics team achievements, community service hours I'd logged at the legal aid clinic. I told my parents at dinner. Just stated it plainly. I got into state with a full scholarship. I'm going to study political science and pre-law. My father had paused mid-chew. "Law school? That's a long road, Rebecca, and expensive. Are you sure you wouldn't rather do something more practical? Teaching, maybe? Or nursing?" "The scholarship covers undergrad," I'd said. "I'll figure out law school when I get there." Ashley, who was 19 and currently between jobs after quitting her position at a boutique, the manager was threatened by my natural charisma, had rolled her eyes. "God, Becca, you're going to be so boring. Imagine reading dusty books for the rest of your life." My mother had reached over and patted Ashley's hand. "Not everyone can be creative like you, sweetheart." No congratulations, no celebration. Just a vague sense that I'd announced I was moving to Mars. But when I actually got into law school 3 years later, Georgetown on a partial scholarship, that's when it got worse. I'd been home for Christmas break, working my 3rd job as a night shift paralegal at a small firm, trying to save money for the move. The acceptance letter had arrived that morning. I'd been carrying it in my coat pocket all day, the weight of it both thrilling and terrifying. I waited until after dinner. Ashley was there, visiting for the holidays between her latest career pivot. She was trying to be a lifestyle influencer, which mostly meant posting photos of brunches she couldn't afford. "I have some news," I'd said, pulling out the letter. "I got into Georgetown Law. I start in the fall." The silence that followed wasn't the stunned silence of pride. It was the calculating silence of a bank loan officer assessing risk. My mother stopped clearing dishes. She looked at the letter, then at me. Her first question wasn't congratulations. "Is it expensive?" she asked. "Because we just put a down payment on a condo for Ashley. She needs a safe place to live while she figures out her brand strategy." My father sighed, pushing his potatoes around his plate. "Lawyers. You're going to be one of those people who sues doctors for trying to help people." "I'm going to be a prosecutor," I said quietly. "Or maybe work in civil rights." Ashley, sitting across from me, had laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Well, I hope you make a lot of money, Beck. You're going to need it. You'll be so bored. Imagine analyzing cases all day while the rest of us are actually living." That was it. That was the celebration. No champagne, no cake, no hugs. Just worry about the cost and dismissal of the ambition. I realized then, sitting at that table, that to them, my success wasn't a point of pride. It was a threat. If I succeeded without their help, it highlighted how much help they'd given Ashley. If I became something substantial, it made Ashley's drifting look like failure. So they had to minimize me. They had to frame my ambition as coldness, my independence as selfishness, my success as luck. From that day forward, I stopped telling them anything that mattered. I didn't tell them when I made law review. I didn't tell them when I secured a clerkship with Judge Patricia Morgan, one of the most respected judges in the circuit. I didn't tell them when I passed the bar exam in the 99th percentile. I just showed up for holidays, smiled politely, and answered their questions with vague pleasantries. "How's work?" my mother would ask. "Fine," I'd say. "Still reading all those dusty books?" my father would joke. Something like that. They interpreted my silence as arrogance, as proof that I thought I was better than them. They told extended family I was distant, that I was too serious, that success had changed me. They didn't understand that I wasn't protecting myself out of spite. I was protecting myself out of necessity. I was building a silo around my life so they couldn't contaminate it, so they couldn't take my achievements and twist them into something small. Meanwhile, Ashley's life was a public performance. Her career path was a jagged line of false starts that were always reframed as adventures. She was a receptionist, then a lifestyle blogger, then a yoga instructor, then a social media coordinator for a boutique that went bankrupt in 6 months. Through it all, my parents applauded her bravery and creativity. They bailed her out of credit card debt twice. They co-signed leases she broke. They created a safety net so thick she could never actually hit the ground. But since she couldn't find an identity in work, Ashley found it in men, or more specifically, in men's resumes. Ashley didn't date men, she dated zip codes and job titles. In her late 20s, there was the surgeon. She didn't talk about his sense of humor or his kindness. She talked about the hospital he was affiliated with, the country club where his parents were members, the medical conferences she'd get to attend as his plus one. When that ended, because he realized she was more interested in his Amex Black Card than his thoughts, she was devastated. Not because she'd lost him, but because she'd lost the access. Then there was the real estate developer, then the investment banker. Each time, the introduction was the same. She'd bring them to family dinners and present them like trophies she'd hunted. And then, 18 months ago, she met Ethan Bradford. I remember the phone call. I'd been at the office drafting an opinion on an environmental case when my phone rang. "Rebecca, you're not going to believe who I'm seeing," Ashley had breathed, her voice high with excitement. "Who?" I'd asked, not looking up from my screen. "His name is Ethan Bradford. And before you ask, yes, that Bradford. His dad is Thomas Bradford, the federal judge." She'd said federal judge with a capitalization you could hear. To her, it wasn't a job description. It was a brand. The ultimate accessory. I knew who Thomas Bradford was. Everyone in the legal community in the Great Lakes District knew who he was. Brilliant, exacting, with a reputation for suffering no fools. His opinions were assigned reading in constitutional law courses. He was formidable. The idea of my flighty, superficial sister sitting at a dinner table with Thomas Bradford would have been comical if it weren't so tragic. "That's great, Ash," I'd said, still typing. "I'm happy for you." "You have to meet him. I'm bringing him to Mom and Dad's barbecue next month. You'll come, right?" "I'll try." I'd gone to that barbecue, and I'd met Ethan Bradford for the first time. Now, sitting in my chambers as the winter light faded outside, I thought about that barbecue, about the moment I'd realized what Ashley was really doing. Ethan had been nice. That was the word that came to mind. Pleasant. He was 35, a commercial real estate attorney, quiet, well-dressed in the way that came from old money. But there was something tired in his eyes. He looked like a man who'd been following a script written for him before he was born, and he was exhausted from the performance. I'd watched them together across my parents' backyard. Ashley had been hanging off his arm, beaming, talking loudly to my aunt about the wedding venue they were looking at in the city, even though they'd only been dating 3 months. Ethan had been smiling, but his eyes weren't engaged. He was nodding at the right times, sipping his drink, drifting. When Ashley introduced him to our cousin, she didn't say, "This is Ethan. He loves sailing and historical fiction." She said, "This is Ethan. His family founded the Bradford firm. His dad is the judge." I'd seen Ethan flinch. It was microscopic, a tightening of the jaw, a slight shift of his gaze to the ground. He hated it, hated being his father's son before he was his own person. But Ashley didn't see it. She didn't see people. She saw mirrors, reflecting back her own ambitions. During that barbecue, I'd tried to talk to Ethan. I'd walked over while Ashley was busy showing off her engagement ring to a group of neighbors. "Hi, Ethan," I'd said. "I'm Rebecca. We haven't really had a chance to talk." He'd looked relieved to have a break from the performance. "Hi, Rebecca. Ashley says you work in the city, right? At the federal building?" I'd paused. This was the test. "Yes," I'd said carefully. "What do you do? Administration?" And there it was, the lie. Ashley had told him I was a clerk, a secretary, someone who filed paperwork and answered phones. She'd diminished me to ensure she remained the star of this production. If I told him the truth right then, that I was a federal judge, that I'd been appointed to the bench 6 months ago after a stellar career as a prosecutor, it would have shattered the reality Ashley had built. It would have humiliated her in front of her fiancé's family, in front of everyone. And despite everything, despite the years of neglect and passive-aggressive comments, I still had that stupid ingrained reflex to protect her. Something like that, I'd said, taking a sip of my iced tea. I handle a lot of paperwork. Ethan had nodded, already losing interest. That's good. Stable work. He hadn't asked more. He hadn't cared. To him, I was just background, a minor character in the merging of their two dynasties. I'd walked away from that conversation feeling something cold and heavy settle in my stomach. Ashley wasn't marrying this man because she loved him. She was marrying him because she loved the way his last name sounded when she practiced signing it in her journal. She loved the idea of the rehearsal dinner, the country club reception, the proximity to power. She didn't understand that power isn't about who you know, it's about what you can do. Now, staring at that text message on my phone, "Don't come, you'll embarrass me." I understood what Ashley really feared. She wasn't afraid I'd use the wrong fork. She wasn't afraid I'd wear the wrong dress or say something awkward about politics. She was afraid that if I walked into that room with Thomas Bradford present, the flimsy cardboard cutout she'd made of me would dissolve. She was afraid that her father-in-law, the man she revered as a deity of status, might actually have more in common with the spare sister than with the golden child. She was trying to quarantine the truth. But the truth, I'd learned in my years on the bench, is a pathogen. It always finds a way out. My phone rang, shattering my thoughts. I looked at the screen. Not a number I recognized immediately, but it was a local area code. I hesitated, then answered. "This is Rebecca Hayes." "Rebecca." The voice on the other end was unmistakable, deep, warm, with the kind of authority that made bailiffs straighten their spines from 50 feet away. It was Judge Patricia Morgan. "Patricia," I said, surprised. "I wasn't expecting—" "Cut the pleasantries, Rebecca," she interrupted, though I could hear the smile in her voice. "I'm sitting here looking at my calendar, and I see I have a +1 for a dinner tonight at the Ivory Terrace. My husband, bless his heart, has decided his gout is flaring up and he'd rather stay home and watch the History Channel." I went very still. The Ivory Terrace, that was where the rehearsal dinner was being held. "I tried calling your chambers, but Andrew said you'd left for the day," Patricia continued. "I need a date, and I need someone who can hold a conversation that doesn't revolve around golf scores or stock portfolios." "Patricia," I began, my throat tight. "That dinner, it's the Bradford rehearsal dinner." "I know whose dinner it is," she said calmly. "Thomas and I went to law school together. We clerked for the same circuit judge back in the 70s. He sent me the invitation months ago." There was a pause, and the silence on the line grew heavy with implication. "I also heard through the very efficient grapevine, my hairdresser Barbara, who also does your mother's hair, that you're not attending tonight, something about a conflict." It wasn't a question. Patricia Morgan didn't ask questions she didn't already know the answer to. "I was asked not to come," I said quietly. "Figured as much," Patricia said, her voice taking on an edge. "Thomas mentioned to me last week that he was looking forward to meeting his future daughter-in-law's sister. Said he'd heard you were in administration. Very interested in the court system, apparently." I closed my eyes, the shame of it, hearing it repeated by Patricia, who knew exactly who and what I was. "He seemed to think you were a secretary of some kind," Patricia continued. "I didn't correct him. Thought it would be more fun if you did it yourself." She let that hang in the air between us. "Rebecca, I'm outside your building right now. The driver is double parked. You have 5 minutes to get down here." I stared at my reflection in the darkened window of my office. The woman looking back at me was dressed in a navy blue dress I'd bought specifically for tonight. Elegant, professional, the kind of dress that didn't apologize for existing. "Patricia," I started, and hated how uncertain my voice sounded. "Ashley is my sister. This is her wedding. What if I'm being vindictive? What if I'm using my position to punish her for what?" Patricia's voice was sharp. "For lying about you? For erasing your identity? For treating you like you're shameful?" I didn't answer. "Rebecca," Patricia said, and her voice softened slightly. Let me tell you something about your sister that you already know but won't admit. She didn't ban you from this dinner because you're embarrassing. She banned you because you're not. I gripped the phone tighter. She knows, Patricia continued, that if you walk into that room and Thomas Bradford sees you, really sees you, the entire house of cards collapses. Because Thomas doesn't care about pedigree or society connections. He cares about one thing, intellect, and your sister knows she can't compete with you in that arena. But what if— Stop, Patricia commanded. Stop acting like the defendant and start acting like the verdict. You're a federal judge, Rebecca. When did we start negotiating with lies? The words hit me like a gavel strike. I looked at my desk, at the case files, at the invitation with my name printed in gold, at the text message still glowing on my phone screen. You'll embarrass me. For 39 years, I'd made myself smaller to make others comfortable. I'd hidden my achievements, downplayed my intelligence, stayed in the shadows so Ashley could stand in the light. And where had it gotten me? A text message banning me from my own sister's wedding. I'll be right down, I said. Good, Patricia replied. And Rebecca, wear those heels that make you taller, the navy ones. She hung up. I stood, grabbed my coat and clutch, and walked out of my chambers without looking back. The Lincoln town car smelled of expensive leather and Patricia's signature perfume, something with sandalwood and white pepper. She sat on the opposite side of the back seat, looking immaculate in a charcoal wool coat, her silver hair cut in a sharp bob that swung like a blade. Buckle up, Patricia said as the car pulled away from the curb. We have a reservation to crash, but first, we need to talk. I fastened my seatbelt, my hands steadier now. Talk about what? About what you're walking into. Patricia turned to face me fully. When's the last time you saw your sister? 3 months ago, Thanksgiving. And? She spent the entire dinner talking about the Bradford family tree. She'd memorized it, knew which relatives went to which Ivy League schools, who sat on which corporate boards. She barely asked me a single question. Patricia nodded. And your parents? They were— I paused, searching for the word. Impressed, thrilled. My mother kept saying things like, finally, one of our girls is really making something of herself. And you said? Nothing. I ate my turkey and left early. Patricia reached into her handbag and pulled out her reading glasses. Let me tell you a story about Thomas Bradford. We were study partners at Yale, spring semester 1976. There was a professor, Theodore Crane, brilliant but ruthless. He had this habit of cold-calling students and eviscerating them if they weren't prepared. I listened, watching the city lights blur past the window. One day he called on Thomas, asked him to summarize a 100-page opinion on Fourth Amendment search and seizure. Thomas had been up all night with his girlfriend, now his ex-wife, and he hadn't read it. He tried to bluff his way through, and Crane destroyed him, made him look like a fool in front of 80 students. What did Thomas do? He came to my apartment that night and he cried. Patricia said this matter-of-factly, not because his pride was hurt, but because he disrespected the law by not being prepared. He made me quiz him for 6 hours straight. Next class, he walked in and delivered a 15-minute analysis of that opinion that made Crane actually applaud. She turned to look at me. The point, Rebecca, is that Thomas Bradford is not some untouchable deity. He's a man who values one thing above all else, people who take the law seriously, people who do the work. What did he say when you told him about me? I asked quietly. Patricia smiled. When I got the invitation to this dinner 3 months ago, I called Thomas to congratulate him. We caught up for about 20 minutes, and then he asked me if I knew a Rebecca Hayes. My heart stopped. He said he'd seen the name on the guest list and recognized it. He asked me, is this the same Rebecca Hayes who wrote that dissenting opinion on the EPA case last month? The one who cited the 1942 precedent regarding eminent domain? I stared at her. That was an obscure opinion. I didn't think anyone outside the circuit would. Thomas reads everything, Patricia interrupted. I told him yes, that you were my protege, that you were the sharpest mind to come out of this district in a decade. She paused. You know what he said? I shook my head. He said, good, Finally, someone at this wedding who can actually hold a conversation. I want to meet her. The revelation hit me with physical force. Thomas Bradford had wanted to meet me. He'd been looking forward to it. And Ashley, knowing this, had systematically prevented it from happening. "She's been keeping you away from him," I said, the pieces clicking into place. "Of course she has," Patricia said. "Because the moment Thomas sees you as his intellectual equal, your sister becomes just the wife of his son. She stops being special. She stops being the connection to power. She becomes ordinary." The car slowed. Through the tinted windows, I could see the ivory terrace, a limestone building glowing with warm golden light. Valets were running back and forth with umbrellas, opening doors for guests in tuxedos and evening gowns. My stomach flipped. I could see my parents' car near the entrance, and there, standing under the awning, was Ashley. She looked radiant in a cream-colored dress, her blonde hair swept up, directing arriving guests like she was conducting an orchestra. "I can't believe I'm doing this," I said. Patricia reached over and squeezed my hand. "You've spent 39 years playing the role they wrote for you, Rebecca. Tonight, you go off script." The car came to a stop. The driver appeared with an umbrella. "One last thing," Patricia said as she prepared to open her door. "When we walk in, don't look for Ashley. Don't look for your parents. Look at Thomas. He's the only other adult in the room." I nodded, taking a deep breath. I smoothed the skirt of my navy dress and checked my reflection in the dark window one last time. The woman staring back at me didn't look like a filing clerk. She didn't look like someone's embarrassing sister. She looked like a federal judge who had just arrived to preside over a very important case. The door opened. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and expensive perfume. "Ready, Your Honor?" Patricia asked, stepping out into the light. I stepped out after her, my heels clicking sharply on the wet pavement. "Ready?" I said, and for the first time in my life, I meant it. The Ivory Terrace wasn't merely a restaurant. It was a fortress of exclusivity, built from limestone, velvet, and the kind of hush that costs $500 a plate. The private dining room reserved for the Bradford rehearsal dinner was located at the very back, accessed through a corridor lined with oil paintings of men who looked like they'd personally invented capitalism. As I walked down that hallway behind Patricia, my heels sinking into the plush carpet, I felt the atmosphere shift. We were moving from the public world into the inner sanctum where titles and lineage were the only currencies that mattered. The maitre d' standing at the double mahogany doors was a man who looked like he'd been born wearing a tuxedo. He saw us approaching and stiffened, his hand raising in a polite but firm gesture of interception. He didn't recognize me, which was expected. But as his eyes moved to Patricia, his posture collapsed from guardianship to servitude in the span of a single heartbeat. "Judge Morgan," he breathed, bowing his head slightly. "We weren't expecting you until the second course." Patricia didn't break stride. She moved with the kinetic energy of a battleship. "Plans change, Arthur, and I brought a guest. We'll need 2 settings added to the head table." Arthur didn't ask for names. He didn't check a list. When Patricia Morgan gave an order, you followed it. He simply opened the doors. The sound that spilled out was the low, melodious hum of wealthy people enjoying being wealthy, the clinking of heavy silver against bone china, the soft ripple of laughter that never got too loud, and the underlying murmur of networking disguised as socializing. We stepped across the threshold. The room was magnificent. A chandelier the size of a small car hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting fractured diamond-like light over 3 long tables arranged in a U-shape. At the head of the formation sat the patriarchs and matriarchs, flanked by what I assumed were Ethan and Ashley. For 3 seconds, no one noticed us. We were just movement in the periphery, perhaps staff bringing more champagne. I scanned the room with the systematic assessment of someone trained to read people. I saw my parents first, my father laughing too hard at someone's joke, a sure sign he was nervous. My mother was picking at her salad, her eyes darting around as if checking for invisible threats. Even from here, I could see the tension in her shoulders. Then I saw Ashley. She was standing near the head table in a cream silk dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. She looked like a bridal magazine come to life, radiant, glowing, triumphant. She was leaning over to whisper something to Ethan, who sat beside her with a champagne flute in his hand, looking politely engaged but distant. She must have sensed something, the way a prey animal senses a predator. She turned her head, perhaps just doing a routine scan of her domain, making sure everything was perfect. Her eyes swept over the entrance. They passed Patricia, registered her as someone important but couldn't quite place her. Then they landed on me. I watched it happen in real time. It was like watching a film reel melt in a projector. The practiced, beatific smile that had been plastered on her face faltered. The corners of her mouth twitched downward. Her eyes widened, not with surprise, but with primal, animalistic panic. The color drained from her cheeks so fast it looked like a magic trick, leaving her pale and ghostly under the crystal lights. For a split second, she was paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what she was seeing. In her carefully constructed reality, I was safely contained in my apartment, ashamed and obedient. My presence here was a glitch in her code, an error that shouldn't be possible. Then the paralysis broke. She set her champagne glass down on the table with a clatter that was just loud enough to turn a few heads nearby. She didn't excuse herself. She didn't smooth her dress. She practically lunged toward us, abandoning Ethan mid-sentence. She crossed the room with a speed that bordered on undignified, her heels clicking rapid fire against the hardwood floor. Her eyes were locked on me, blazing with a mixture of fury and terror. She reached us before we'd taken 5 steps into the room, positioning her body between me and the head table like a human barricade. "What are you doing here?" she hissed. Her voice was a strangled whisper, pitched low so the rest of the room wouldn't hear, but the venom in it was unmistakable. Up close, I could see the fine tremor in her hands, the way her breath was coming too fast. "I told you not to come," she said, her hands clenching at her sides. "I told you explicitly. You're not welcome here. You're going to ruin everything." She still hadn't looked at Patricia. She was so blinded by her need to excise me from the room that she didn't register the woman standing 12 inches to my left, a woman who commanded more respect in legal circles than most senators. I opened my mouth to speak, to offer some calm explanation, but Patricia beat me to it. "Excuse me," Patricia said. The tone was not loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was the tone Patricia used when a lawyer made a frivolous objection in her courtroom, a tone of absolute crushing dismissal. Ashley flinched, snapping her head toward Patricia. She blinked rapidly, trying to place the older woman. Her social radar, usually so sharp, was jamming. She saw the expensive coat, the pearls, the way Patricia held herself like she owned the building. But Ashley couldn't categorize her. Was she a donor? A politician's wife? Someone from the Bradford's Country Club? "I'm sorry," Ashley stammered, her voice shifting instantly from aggressive to obsequious. "This is a private family event. My sister was just leaving. She's confused." "She's not confused," Patricia said coolly, each word precisely enunciated. "And she's not leaving." Ashley looked back at me, her eyes pleading and hateful all at once. "Rebecca, please, please don't do this to me. Just go. We can talk tomorrow, I promise, but right now—" "I'm a guest," I said quietly. The words came out steadier than I felt. "I was invited." Patricia stepped forward, forcing Ashley to take a step back. "I was invited by Thomas Bradford. Rebecca is my +1. Ashley's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The logic didn't track. Her sister, the office administrator, the poor relation, the embarrassment, was the guest of honor of a woman who spoke with the authority of God. "Who are you?" Ashley whispered, and for the first time, I heard real fear in her voice. At that moment, the conversation at the head table died down. The commotion at the door had finally drawn attention. People were turning in their chairs, forks pausing halfway to mouths. The low hum of conversation dropped to a murmur, then to silence. I felt the weight of 75 pairs of eyes landing on us. Ethan looked up from his seat. He saw me standing there, and his expression shifted to pure confusion. He looked from me to Ashley's panicked face, trying to piece together a puzzle he didn't know he was solving. And then, from the center of the head table, Thomas Bradford turned. He was exactly as I'd imagined from reading his opinions. A man of 65 with a mane of silver hair and a face carved from granite. He held a wine glass in one hand and he looked vaguely bored, the way intelligent men often look at mandatory social obligations. He glanced toward the door, likely expecting to see a latecomer he would have to politely acknowledge. His gaze swept over Ashley without pausing. She was furniture. It moved to Patricia, and his face brightened with recognition and genuine pleasure. Then his eyes locked on me. I stopped breathing. This was the moment. This was the cliff edge. If he looked at me with confusion, if he looked at me with the polite dismissal reserved for strangers, Ashley would win. She could usher me out as the crazy sister who'd crashed the party. Thomas's eyes narrowed slightly, focusing. He leaned forward in his chair, adjusting his glasses. I could see his mind working, connecting dots. Then he did something that made the entire room draw a sharp, collective breath. He stood up. In the hierarchy of formal dining, the patriarch does not stand for a late guest. The patriarch remains seated, offers a polite nod, perhaps raises a glass. But Thomas Bradford pushed his chair back and rose to his full height, 6 feet 2 inches of judicial authority. He placed his napkin on the table with deliberate care. He didn't look at his son. He didn't look at Ashley, who had gone completely still beside me. He walked around the table, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor, bypassing servers with trays of wine, bypassing family friends and business associates. He walked straight toward us. Ashley stepped back involuntarily, her face draining of the last dregs of color. She looked at Thomas, then at me, waiting for him to order security to remove the intruder. She opened her mouth, trying to provide him with the narrative before I could. "Thomas, I'm so sorry," she began, her voice trembling. "My sister just showed up uninvited. I was just telling her—" Thomas walked past her. He walked past her as if she were a piece of furniture, as if she hadn't spoken at all. The cut was so complete, so absolute, that several people gasped. He stopped 3 feet in front of me. The room was silent, that terrible, weighted silence that feels like the moment before a verdict is read. Thomas Bradford looked me in the eye. There was no judgment in his face, no confusion. There was only the deep, respectful recognition of one warrior acknowledging another across a battlefield. He extended his hand. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the silence. "I didn't expect to see you here." The words hung in the air like smoke. "Your Honor." It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. He said it with the capitalization, with the reverence that title demanded. He said it the way one federal judge addresses another, as an equal, as a colleague, as a peer. I took his hand. His grip was firm, warm, and dry. "Good evening, Judge Bradford," I replied, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." Thomas laughed, a genuine warm sound that shocked everyone who knew him as the Ice King of the circuit. "The pleasure is mine," he said, still holding my hand. "I read your opinion on the Kensington case last week. The way you dismantled the defense's argument regarding statute of limitations, brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I haven't seen procedural analysis that sharp in 20 years. He turned to Patricia, grinning. "Patricia, you didn't tell me you were bringing the heavy artillery tonight." Patricia smiled, patting my arm. "I thought you might appreciate some intelligent conversation for a change, Thomas." The silence that followed wasn't merely quiet. It was the sound of a paradigm shifting. It was the sound of 100 assumptions shattering at once. I glanced to my left. Ashley was standing there, but she wasn't the same person who had marched up to me 30 seconds ago. She looked like she'd been struck by lightning. Her mouth was slightly open, her carefully applied lipstick suddenly garish against her pale skin. Her eyes were darting from Thomas to me to Patricia, trying to process data that contradicted every single thing she'd told herself and everyone else. "Your Honor." The words were still echoing in the acoustically perfect room. I could see people leaning toward each other, whispering. Some were pulling out their phones, no doubt Googling my name. Ethan was standing now, too. He was looking at me with a completely new expression, not the polite disinterest of meeting his fiancée's boring sister, but the sharp attention of a lawyer who'd just realized he'd been given false evidence. He looked at me, then at his father, then at Ashley. The look on his face wasn't anger yet. It was something worse, a profound, disorienting realization that nothing he'd been told was true. My parents were frozen at their table 4 chairs away. My father's fork was suspended in mid-air, forgotten. My mother was gripping her napkin so hard her knuckles had gone white. They'd known I was a lawyer. They'd known I had a good job at the courthouse. But they'd never bothered to learn my title. They'd never asked. And hearing the most powerful man in the room address their spare daughter with a title that outranked everyone else at the table, it was incomprehensible. Thomas didn't notice the shockwaves rippling through the room. Or perhaps he did and simply didn't care. He was focused entirely on me, his eyes bright with genuine interest. "Please," he said, gesturing toward the head table. "We have space. I insist. I want to hear your thoughts on the new federal sentencing guidelines. I've been arguing with the committee all month, but I have a feeling you might have a different perspective." He wasn't asking. He wasn't being polite. He was offering me the seat beside him, the seat of honor at the head table. I looked at Ashley one last time. Our eyes met, and in that glance, everything unsaid between us became clear. She didn't see her sister. She didn't see the girl she'd grown up with. She saw a stranger, a powerful stranger who'd just destroyed her carefully constructed narrative with 2 words. "Your Honor." "I would love to, Judge Bradford," I said. Thomas offered me his arm. Patricia took his other side, and together, the 3 of us walked past my stunned sister, past my gaping parents, past the confused groom, straight to the head of the table. As I sat down in the chair, a server was hurriedly preparing. I heard Ashley make a sound behind me, half whimper, half gasp. The sound of a woman watching her world collapse in real time. The server rushed over to pour wine into my glass, his hands shaking slightly. The sound of the dark red liquid hitting the crystal was the only sound in the room. No one was eating. No one was talking. 75 people were frozen in a tableau of shock. Ethan remained standing, staring at me from across the table. His face had gone through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, realization, and now something that looked like dawning horror. "You're a judge," he said finally. His voice was quiet, but in the silence, it carried to every corner of the room. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation directed at someone not present in the statement. I picked up my napkin, unfolded it with deliberate care, and placed it across my lap. I looked him straight in the eye. "Yes, Ethan," I said clearly. "I am." Ethan's jaw tightened. He turned slowly, so slowly, to look at Ashley, who was still standing alone in the middle of the floor, 15 feet from the nearest table. She looked like a ghost in her cream silk dress, utterly isolated. "You told me she was a secretary," Ethan said. The words were flat, devoid of emotion, which somehow made them more devastating than if he'd shouted them. Ashley opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I didn't say. It was a misunderstanding." "You said," Ethan continued, his voice taking on the precise prosecutorial tone of a lawyer building a case, and I quote, "She's basically a glorified secretary. She answers phones and files papers." "Ethan, please, I can explain." But Ethan wasn't listening anymore. He looked at his father with an expression of such profound betrayal that even I, a stranger to their family dynamics, felt it. Thomas met his son's gaze steadily. "Sit down, Ethan," he said quietly. "We'll discuss this later." It was not a request. Ethan sat, but he didn't look at Ashley. He stared at his plate, his jaw working, his hands clenched into fists on the white tablecloth. Ashley stood there for another 5 seconds, looking around wildly for an ally, for someone to save her. But the room had made its judgment. The collective body language was clear. "You're on your own." Finally, she moved to the empty chair at the far end of the head table, the chair that had been mine originally, placed at the wing, as far from the center of power as one could be while still technically seated at the main table. She sank into it like a woman drowning, her hands trembling as she reached for her water glass. My parents had still not moved. They looked like they'd been turned to stone. Greek statues depicting the concept of shock and awe. Patricia leaned over to me, her voice low. "Breathe, Rebecca. You're doing fine." I realized I'd been holding my breath. I exhaled slowly, picked up my wine glass, and took a small sip. The wine was excellent, probably a $200 bottle. It tasted like vindication. Thomas, seemingly oblivious to, or perhaps deliberately ignoring, the emotional carnage around him, picked up his fork. "The lobster bisque is excellent tonight," he said conversationally. "Arthur tells me they flew the lobsters in from Maine this morning." It was a signal. The room could exist again. Permission granted to resume normal function. Slowly, conversations started up again. Forks clinked against plates. The spell was broken, though the undercurrent of gossip hummed beneath every polite exchange. I could hear fragments of whispered conversations. "Did you see Thomas's face?" "Federal judge, apparently." "Why didn't Ashley tell us?" "Awkward, doesn't even begin." Patricia and Thomas began discussing a recent Supreme Court decision about environmental regulations. I listened, occasionally offering an observation, falling into the familiar rhythm of legal discourse. This was my language. This was my world. Ethan said nothing. He pushed food around his plate, his face a mask of controlled fury. And Ashley sat at the far end of the table, utterly forgotten, watching her engagement party continue without her at its center. The soup course arrived, bowls of bisque so perfectly presented they looked like art installations. Steam rose from the surface, carrying the scent of cream and tarragon. For several minutes, the only sounds were the genteel noises of expensive dining, but I could feel the tension thrumming beneath the surface, like electrical current running through water. Thomas broke the silence first, turning to me with the kind of focused attention that made witnesses nervous in his courtroom. "I've been dealing with an unusual procedural issue," he said, cutting through a piece of artisan bread. "Racketeering case. Sealed indictments creating discovery problems. The defense is arguing they can't mount adequate representation without the full witness list." I nodded, understanding the dilemma immediately. "Are you concerned about Brady violations, or is it more about the scope of the protective order?" "Both, actually," Thomas said, his eyes lighting up with professional interest. "The prosecution wants to keep certain witnesses sealed until trial for security reasons, but the defense counsel is competent enough to know that's a potential appellate issue." "That's the eternal tension with organized crime cases," Patricia interjected, dabbing her mouth with her napkin. "Security versus due process. Thread the needle wrong and you've got a mistrial or a reversal on appeal." "We had a similar issue in the Merriweather merger," Ethan said suddenly, his first contribution to the conversation. His voice was hoarse. "Information asymmetry in negotiations. Different stakes, obviously, but the same principle. One party can't make informed decisions without access to material information." "Exactly," I said, grateful for the neutral territory of legal theory. "The question is always whether the restriction on information is proportional to the harm it prevents. In your father's racketeering case, witness safety might justify limited disclosure. In your merger, material information is fundamental to the contract's validity." Thomas nodded approvingly. "That's the analysis. The question is execution." We fell into an easy rhythm, the three of us, and occasionally Ethan, discussing case law and legal theory. Patricia told a story about a mistrial she'd declared in the 80s when a jury forewoman fell asleep during closing arguments. Thomas countered with a tale of a witness who'd had a panic attack on the stand and confessed to a completely different crime than the one being prosecuted. It was shop talk, the way lawyers decompress, finding humor in the absurdity of the justice system while maintaining deep respect for its importance. I glanced down the table at Ashley. She was sitting rigidly, her soup untouched, her hands folded in her lap. She couldn't participate in this conversation. The language was foreign to her, not the English words, but the concepts, the intellectual framework, the shared understanding of people who'd devoted their lives to the law. She'd spent 2 years trying to fit into this world through clothing and manners and name-dropping, but she'd missed the fundamental truth. The Bradfords weren't impressed by social climbing. They were impressed by competence. I felt a strange mixture of emotions looking at her: pity, anger, and a cold sort of relief. This was always going to happen. The lie was always going to collapse. I'd just accelerated the timeline. The main course was cleared away, filet mignon with truffle butter, barely touched by half the table. The tension had killed most people's appetites. Then Thomas did something that made every person in that room straighten in their chair. He tapped his knife against his wine glass. The sharp, clear ring cut through the conversations. Silence fell instantly, absolute and expectant. This was the moment, the traditional rehearsal dinner toast, where the father of the groom welcomes the bride into the family, tells a charming anecdote, and raises a glass to love and future happiness. Ashley looked up from her end of the table, a desperate hope kindling in her eyes. This was her chance. Thomas would smooth everything over, make it right, restore the order she needed. Thomas stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor. He held his glass of Cabernet aloft, the dark liquid catching the chandelier light. He looked around the room slowly, letting the silence stretch. 5 seconds. 10. The anticipation became uncomfortable. He looked at his son, who was staring at the tablecloth. He looked at Ashley, his face unreadable. Then he turned to me. "I would like to propose a toast," Thomas said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the room. He raised his glass higher, but he didn't point it toward the bride and groom. He pointed it toward me. "To the law," Thomas said, "and to those rare, principled few who serve it with integrity." A ripple of confusion went through the guests. This wasn't the script. This wasn't how rehearsal dinner toasts worked. Thomas smiled down at me, and it was a smile of genuine warmth and respect. "Tonight, I want to drink to a guest who reminded me why we do what we do. To Judge Hayes, for her brilliance on the bench, for her courage in the face of omission, and for reminding me that truth is the only foundation worth building on." He paused, making direct eye contact with me. "To Judge Hayes," he said clearly. "The woman who makes me believe the system still has a future." He tipped his glass toward me in a gesture of unmistakable honor. The room was paralyzed. The father of the groom had just toasted the sister of the bride instead of the bride herself. It was a social execution, public and brutal. Then Patricia raised her glass. "To Judge Hayes," she echoed, her voice strong and clear. Ethan hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Then he raised his glass. "To Rebecca," he said quietly. Like dominoes falling, the rest of the room followed. 75 glasses rose into the air. 75 voices murmured my name. "To Judge Hayes." I sat there, feeling the strange, cold burn of vindication. I nodded my head in acknowledgement and took a small sip of wine. I didn't smile. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a funeral for a lie, and funerals require solemnity. Ashley didn't drink. She sat with her hands in her lap, her face pale and rigid. The humiliation was total. She'd been erased from her own event, replaced by the person she'd tried to hide. I looked at her across the expanse of white tablecloth and crystal stemware. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something I'd never seen before in my sister's face. The complete absence of hope. She'd built her entire identity on becoming Mrs. Ethan Bradford, on being welcomed into this family, on being the star of this show, and in less than 10 minutes, I'd dismantled it all with my mere presence. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt tired. Thomas sat back down, already moving on to the next course as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "Now, Rebecca, about those sentencing guidelines. I'm curious about your position on departure motions in white-collar cases." And just like that, dinner continued. Ashley sat at her own rehearsal dinner, a ghost at her own feast, while the rest of us talked about the law. The evening stretched on, course after course, each one more elaborate than the last. Conversation flowed at the head table, easy, intellectual, occasionally punctuated by laughter. Ethan gradually thawed, drawn into the discussion despite himself. But Ashley never recovered. She sat in her cream silk dress at the far end of the table, picking at her food, occasionally lifting her water glass with a shaking hand. Several guests approached her to offer congratulations on the wedding, but the conversations were strained, brief. Everyone could sense the shift in power, the reordering of the hierarchy. When dessert arrived, individual chocolate soufflés that collapsed the moment you touched them with a spoon, Ashley quietly stood up and walked toward the restroom. She didn't come back for 20 minutes, and when she did return, her eyes were red, her makeup hastily reapplied, her smile brittle as glass. The evening that was supposed to be her coronation had become her trial, and the verdict had already been delivered. After the main course, Thomas placed his napkin on the table and stood. "I think," he said, his voice carrying that unmistakable weight of judicial authority, "we need some air." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a venue change. Ethan stood immediately, looking grateful for an escape route. Patricia rose with the grace of someone who'd been attending formal dinners for 50 years. I stood last, feeling the eyes of the room dragging across my skin like hooks. As we walked toward the French doors that led to the terrace, I could feel Ashley's gaze burning into my back. I knew she wanted to follow, wanted to run after us and clutch at Ethan's arm, wanted to spin another web of excuses. But something in Thomas's posture, the rigid set of his shoulders, the absolute finality of his movement, kept her pinned to her seat. We stepped out into the night. The terrace was private, a slate-paved garden enclosed by high hedges of manicured boxwood. The freezing rain had slowed to a fine mist that clung to our clothes and hair. It was quiet out here, the city noise muffled by the greenery. The contrast between the heated, perfumed air of the dining room and the sharp, cold bite of the outdoors was shocking. It felt like walking out of a fever dream and into reality. Ethan walked immediately to the edge of the stone railing and gripped it, his knuckles going white. He stared out at the dark silhouette of the skyline, his shoulders shaking, not from the cold, but from something internal, something breaking apart. Thomas stood near one of the heat lamps, the orange glow casting harsh shadows across his face. He took a silver case from his pocket and removed a cigar but didn't light it. He just rolled it between his fingers, a nervous habit I suspected few people ever witnessed. "I'm sorry," Ethan said to the darkness, his voice raw and broken. "I'm so sorry, Rebecca. I had no idea. I should have known. I should have—" "You don't have to apologize, Ethan," I said quietly, crossing my arms against the chill. "You were given false information. You reacted to what you knew. It's not just the lies about you," Ethan said, turning around. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. "I could forgive insecurity. I could forgive jealousy. Everyone has family issues. We all have things we're not proud of." He ran a hand through his hair, making it stand up at odd angles. "But I've felt handled for months. Like I'm not a person. I'm a chess piece." "What do you mean?" Patricia asked, stepping closer. Ethan exhaled, a plume of white breath escaping into the night. "Every time we went out, it wasn't just dinner. It was a networking opportunity. She was always asking who would be there, what firms they worked for, what their net worth was. I told myself she was just ambitious, that she wanted the best for us." He laughed, a bitter, broken sound that didn't match his face. "But last week I came home early from a client meeting. It was 2 in the morning. I found her in the living room going through my briefcase." I stiffened. "Your briefcase?" Ethan nodded, looking at me with an expression that begged for understanding. I had brought home files on the Merriweather merger, highly confidential, pre-acquisition valuations, board meeting notes, things that could move markets if they leaked. He swallowed hard. "She was sitting at the kitchen table, reading them. When I asked what she was doing, she said she was just curious about my day, that she wanted to understand my world so she could support me better." The mist seemed to thicken around us. The temperature felt like it had dropped another 10 degrees. "I believed her," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it was sweet. I thought she cared. But now—" He trailed off, looking at his father. "Now I'm wondering why she needed to know the valuation of a company that hasn't gone public yet. Why she was taking photos of the documents with her phone." "Photos?" Patricia said sharply. "I saw the flash," Ethan said. "At the time, I thought it was just the reflection of the overhead light, but she'd angled her phone over the pages. I'm sure of it now." Thomas finally spoke. He lit the cigar, the flame illuminating his grim expression for a moment before dying. "It goes deeper than that, Ethan." We all turned to look at him. "I didn't want to bring this up until after the wedding," Thomas said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "I thought perhaps I was being paranoid, an overprotective father seeing threats where there were none. But after tonight, after seeing how easily she lies to manipulate something as trivial as a seating chart," he took a drag of the cigar and exhaled a stream of blue smoke that was quickly torn apart by the wind. "I can't keep it quiet anymore." My stomach twisted into a knot. 2 weeks ago, Thomas continued, my head clerk, Julie, came to me. She was uncomfortable about something, didn't know if she should report it. She told me that Ashley had called my chambers. I felt my blood run cold. "She didn't ask for me," Thomas said, looking at Ethan with something like pity in his eyes. "She asked for Julie specifically, told her that she was planning a surprise birthday party for me, which, I should note, my birthday isn't for 6 months. And that she needed the names of the attorneys involved in the racketeering case I'm currently presiding over. Said she wanted to invite them to the party." Patricia let out a low whistle. "That's not party planning, Thomas. That's an intelligence breach." "Exactly," Thomas said. "The racketeering case has sealed indictments. The prosecutors' identities are protected for their safety. We're dealing with organized crime, people who've killed witnesses before." He looked at his son, and I saw genuine pain in his face. "Julie is smart, thank God. She told Ashley she couldn't release that information. And do you know what your fiancé said?" Ethan shook his head, looking like he might be sick. "She said, and I quote, 'Do you know who I am? I'm going to be a Bradford. When I'm family, I'll have access to everything. You might as well give it to me now. Make it easier on yourself.'" The words hung in the frozen air. "She tried to intimidate a federal clerk," Thomas said quietly, "using my family name to obtain protected information in an active criminal case." He dropped the cigar and crushed it under his heel with more force than necessary. "She wasn't trying to throw me a party, son. She was trying to get names. And in this city, in this world, names have a price." I heard myself speak, my voice taking on the cool, analytical tone I used when explaining complicated legal concepts to juries. "She isn't just showing off, she's brokering." Ethan looked at me, his face a mask of confused horror. "What?" "Think about it," I said, and even to my own ears, I sounded like I was delivering a closing argument. "Ashley has been failing at jobs for 10 years. She has no career, no money, no marketable skills beyond social manipulation, but she's always been obsessed with appearing successful." I looked at Ethan, and I felt a strange kinship with him. We were both people who'd been lied to, both people who'd been used. If she marries you, Ethan, she doesn't just get your money or your status. She gets your access. She gets to be the woman who knows things, who can whisper a name to the right person, who can leak a detail about a merger to someone who'll pay for it, who can trade gossip from a federal judge's household for favors. Patricia stepped forward, her face grim. "She's turning herself into a broker of privileged information, the wife who overhears conversations, who has access to briefcases and phone calls, who can't be compelled to testify against her husband." "She isn't marrying you for love," I said to Ethan more gently. "She isn't even marrying you for status. She's marrying you for clearance. She sees your family as a database she can mine." Ethan leaned back against the stone railing, looking like the wind had been knocked out of him. "She used my father's name to lie to a caterer over a dinner party," he said slowly. "If she'd do that over a seating chart, what would she do with a sealed indictment? What would she do with insider trading information?" "She'd sell it," Patricia said flatly. "For money, for access, for the thrill of being the one who knows. She's not stupid, Ethan. She's calculating, and she's been planning this for months, maybe longer." The romantic tragedy of a broken engagement had evaporated. What remained was something darker, more serious. This wasn't a heartbreak. This was a security breach that had been narrowly avoided. Patricia turned to me, her expression softening slightly. "Rebecca, you're the injured party here. She erased you, lied about you, tried to humiliate you to protect this scheme." She paused, looking deep into my eyes. "What do you want to happen tonight?" I looked back at the glass doors. Through the frosted panes, I could see blurred figures inside. My parents were still sitting at their table, probably terrified that Thomas was out here rewriting their financial future. I could see Ashley pacing near the entrance to the hallway, her phone in her hand, likely texting friends to spin a story before this one finished collapsing. I could go back in there and demand an apology. I could tell Ethan to end it right now, publicly with witnesses. I could burn her world down with the same fire she'd started. But I was tired, so tired of the drama, the chaos, the endless cycle of Ashley's crises becoming everyone else's emergency. I don't want revenge, I said quietly. Revenge is messy. It implies I'm acting out of anger. I looked at Thomas. I want the truth to stand in its proper place. That's all. I want Ethan to make a decision based on facts, not on Ashley's performance. And I want my sister to understand that she cannot redact human beings just because they're inconvenient to her narrative. Ethan looked at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. If I end this, he said, his voice cracking, if I go back in there and cancel the wedding, do you feel like I'm destroying your family? Am I tearing you and your sister apart forever? It was a fair question, a kind question. He was worried that by saving himself, he was collateralizing my relationship with my only sibling. I thought about it, really thought about it. I looked at the years of being erased, minimized, used as a prop. I thought about the receipts folder on my phone, about the text message that had started this evening, about sitting in my chambers feeling that familiar spike of cortisol every time Ashley's custom ringtone went off. Ethan, I said, stepping closer to him, you're not destroying anything. You can't break something that's already broken. He looked at me, waiting. My sister destroyed our relationship the moment she decided I was a prop she could discard to make herself look taller. She destroyed it when she lied to you about who I am. She destroyed it when she chose a seating chart over my dignity. I paused, letting the words settle into the cold air. You're not canceling this wedding because of me. You're not doing it to defend my honor. You're canceling it because you finally met the woman you were going to marry, the real woman, not the performance. Ethan nodded slowly, and I saw something shift in his face. The confusion cleared, replaced by a grim resolve. You're right, he said. He looked at his father. I can't marry her, Dad. I can't bring her into this family. Not because she's poor or because she lied about her sister, but because she's a security risk. Because I don't trust a single word that comes out of her mouth. Thomas reached out and put a hand on his son's shoulder. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely emotional. That's a wise ruling, he said quietly. I'm proud of you. We walked back toward the warmth, but before we reached the doors, I saw Ashley through the glass. She was no longer at the table. She was standing in the hallway that led to the restrooms, her back pressed against the wall, her phone clutched in both hands. As we entered, she looked up. Our eyes met, and I saw something I'd never seen in my sister before. Raw, undiluted fear. She pushed off the wall and intercepted me before I could return to the dining room. Rebecca, she said, her voice urgent and low. Kennedy, please, you have to stop this. I pulled my arm away gently but firmly. I'm not doing anything, Ashley. I'm just having dinner. You're humiliating me, she hissed, keeping her voice to a harsh whisper. Everyone is looking at me like I'm nothing. Ethan won't even look at me. Thomas is treating you like you're the queen, and he's treating me like a colleague, I said calmly, with the respect I earned. If that humiliates you, that's not about my actions. That's about your expectations. You have to fix this, Ashley said, and her voice shifted into pleading. You have to talk to Ethan. Tell him I was just stressed, just scared. Tell him I was trying to protect him. From what? I asked. From the truth? From reality? Just, please. Tears were streaming down her face now, cutting tracks through her carefully applied makeup. Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him it was wedding stress. He'll listen to you. You're the brilliant judge now. If you tell him to forgive me, he will. Please, I'm your sister. I looked at her, really looked at her. She was 37 years old. She was my big sister, the person who was supposed to protect me when we were kids. And even now, standing in the ruins of her own making, she was trying to use me. She didn't want my forgiveness. She didn't want my support. She wanted my utility. She wanted me to be the tool that fixed her life, the way I'd always been. "I have a question for you, Ashley," I said quietly. "And I want you to answer honestly, for once in your life." She blinked, wiping mascara from under her eyes. "What? Are you apologizing because you know what you did was wrong? Because you're actually sorry for erasing me, for lying about me, for treating me like a shameful secret you had to hide?" I stepped closer to her. "Or are you apologizing because you're about to lose the Bradford name? Are you sorry you hurt your sister, or are you sorry the credit card is getting declined?" Ashley froze. I watched her try to calculate the right answer, try to summon the tears and the sentiment and the sisterly bond. But she couldn't do it. She couldn't lie to me anymore. The truth was too big, too bright, taking up all the air in the narrow hallway. Kennedy, I need this," she stammered. "I love him. You don't understand." "No, you don't," I said, and my voice was colder than the winter air outside. "You love what he represents. You love the access. And there's nothing wrong with wanting a better life, Ashley. But you tried to build it on lies. You tried to build it by burying me." Ashley's face hardened, the mask finally slipping completely. "What's wrong with wanting more?" she snapped, her voice turning shrill. "You have everything, the career, the respect, the title. I have nothing. I needed this. You could have just stayed home. You could have just let me have this one thing." She was breathing hard now, her chest heaving. "But no. You had to show up. You had to prove how smart you are, how important. You're selfish, Rebecca. You've always been selfish." Before I could respond, a voice cut through the hallway like a whip crack. "That's enough." We both turned. Ethan was standing at the entrance to the hallway, his hands in his pockets, his face carved from stone. He'd followed us. He'd heard everything. "Ethan, no," Ashley started, reaching for him. "She's twisting my words. I didn't mean—" Ethan held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "I heard you, Ashley. I heard every word." He walked closer, and I could see he was barely holding himself together. "You're not sorry. You're just mad you got caught." "Ethan, please," Ashley sobbed, trying to grab his jacket. "We can fix this. It's just wedding nerves, just stress. We're getting married in 2 days. We can—" Ethan caught her wrists gently but firmly, holding them away from his body. "There is no wedding, Ashley." The words dropped like stones into water. "What?" Ashley whispered. "There is no wedding," Ethan repeated, his voice gaining strength. "I'm not marrying you. I'm not marrying a woman who sees my family as a resource to exploit. I'm certainly not marrying a woman who hates her own sister for being successful." He let go of her hands. They fell to her sides, limp. "You need to leave," Ethan said quietly. "No." Ashley's voice was small, broken. "You can't do this. The guests are here. The deposits are paid. My parents, everyone." "Your parents are welcome to finish their meal," Ethan said, his voice completely flat now, drained of all emotion. "But you're done." He pulled out his phone. "I've called a car for you. It's waiting out front." "Ethan!" Ashley wailed, the sound echoing off the walls. But Ethan had already turned away from her. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw exhaustion and relief in equal measure. "Are you coming back to the table?" he asked. "Dad ordered a bottle of the 1995 vintage. He wants you to try it." I glanced at Ashley one last time. She was standing there, mascara running down her face, her cream silk dress suddenly looking tawdry under the harsh hallway lights. She looked at me with pure hatred. "Tell him," she said, her voice desperate and vicious. "Tell him to stop." I looked at my sister, the golden child, the star of every show, the person who'd spent 39 years teaching me that my value was measured by how useful I was to her. "The court has ruled, Ashley," I said quietly. "The session is adjourned." I turned and walked back toward the dining room with Ethan. Behind us, I heard Ashley make a sound, half scream, half sob, but I didn't turn around. As we re-entered the dining room, Thomas looked up from his conversation with Patricia. He saw our faces, saw that his son had made his decision, and gave a single approving nod. I sat back down in my seat. The server immediately appeared with a fresh glass and poured a small amount of deep red wine, the 1995 vintage Thomas had mentioned. "To the truth," Thomas said softly, raising his glass to me. "To the truth," I replied. A moment later, I heard the sound of the side door opening and closing. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of cream silk disappearing into a black town car into the rainy night. The party didn't stop. Conversation didn't falter. In fact, as the door clicked shut, the room seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, as if a toxin had been extracted. For the first time in 39 years, I sat at a family table. Not my family by blood, but family nonetheless. And I didn't feel like a spare part. I felt like I belonged. The 48 hours immediately following the rehearsal dinner were defined by a silence so heavy it felt geological. It was the kind of silence that settles over a landscape after a natural disaster, when the winds have died down and the survivors are just beginning to step out of their shelters to assess the wreckage. I went to work on Monday morning as usual. I parked in my assigned spot at the courthouse, went through the metal detectors, greeted the marshals by name. My routine was a fortress, and I stayed inside it. I had a sentencing hearing at 10, a motion to suppress at 2, and an emergency injunction request that came in at 4:30. I worked until 7, went home, ate leftover Thai food, and went to bed. On the surface, everything was normal, but underneath, I could feel the tremors. By Tuesday afternoon, the silence broke. My phone began ringing during a sentencing hearing. I'd left it on my desk in chambers, but when I returned during a recess, the screen was cluttered with notifications. 12 missed calls from my mother, 7 from my father. A string of text messages that scrolled off the screen. They weren't asking how I was. They weren't asking if I was okay after being publicly humiliated by Ashley's attempted erasure of my identity. They were calling because the reality of their new position had finally set in. They were no longer the future in-laws of the Bradford dynasty. They were the parents of a woman who'd been caught committing social fraud. And they had decided, in a twist of logic that was almost impressive in its audacity, that I was the only person who could fix it. "Call us immediately," my mother had texted. "This is an emergency. Your father is having chest pains." Another message read, "You need to speak to Thomas. You need to explain that Ashley was just under pressure. You're close with him now. He'll listen to you." I put the phone face down on my desk. I didn't call back. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water from the pitcher Andrew kept filled and went back into the courtroom to sentence a man who'd embezzled $50,000 from his employer. As I looked at the defendant, a man who blamed his crime on pressure and expectations, I felt a strange, cold sympathy. He was going to prison for 3 years. Ashley was only facing social exile. In the grand scheme of things, she was getting off light. On Wednesday morning, a courier arrived at my chambers. He wasn't carrying a subpoena or a motion. He was carrying a thick envelope made of heavy cream-colored paper, the kind of stationery that costs more per sheet than most people spend on lunch. The return address was Bradford and Associates. I opened it with my letter opener, the blade slicing cleanly through the fold. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed on Ethan's personal letterhead. "Dear Rebecca, I'm writing this formally because I don't trust myself to speak without emotion right now. As of this morning, I have officially ended my engagement to Ashley. The wedding is canceled. Vendors are being notified, deposits forfeited. My mother is handling the calls to out-of-town guests. I wanted you to know and I wanted to apologize, not for the breakup, but for the months I spent believing a version of you that didn't exist. I pride myself on being a good judge of character, but I allowed my feelings for your sister to blind me to inconsistencies that should have been obvious. That's a failure on my part, and I'm sorry you were the collateral damage of my negligence. My father speaks very highly of you. He's already cited your Kensington opinion in a draft he's writing. He told me last night that you're exactly the kind of jurist he wishes there were more of on the bench, principled, brilliant, and unafraid to stand alone when necessary. I hope that despite the awkwardness of my personal life, we can maintain a professional relationship. In the legal community, you're already building a reputation that will outlast all of this temporary unpleasantness. I would hate to lose the opportunity to learn from you. With sincere respect, Ethan Bradford. I read the letter twice. It was clean, respectful, honest. It was the letter of a man who was hurt but refused to abandon his dignity. He wasn't blaming me. He wasn't asking me to fix anything. He was simply closing the file with the same precision he'd use on a concluded case. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my top drawer. It was the only piece of correspondence from this entire mess that I intended to keep. 2 hours later, Andrew knocked on my door. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Judge Hayes," he said, keeping his voice low. "There's a woman in the lobby. She doesn't have an appointment. She says she's your sister." I looked up from my computer screen. "Is she making a scene?" "No," Andrew said carefully. "But she's crying. The marshals are getting nervous. They want to know if they should remove her." I sighed and closed the environmental case file I'd been reviewing. "Let her up." "But Andrew—" "Yes, Judge." "Leave the door open." 5 minutes later, Ashley appeared in my doorway. She looked like a ghost of the woman who'd stood in the ivory terrace 3 nights ago. She was wearing sweatpants and an oversized trench coat that looked like it had been pulled out of a hamper. Her hair was in a messy ponytail. Her face was swollen and blotchy, completely devoid of makeup. She looked 10 years older and profoundly exhausted. She stood there clutching her purse, waiting for me to invite her in. I didn't stand up. I didn't offer her a chair. I simply waited, my hands folded on my desk, my expression neutral. "Rebecca," she choked out. Her voice was hoarse, like she'd been crying for days. "Kennedy, please." "What do you want, Ashley?" I asked. My tone wasn't cruel, but it wasn't warm either. It was the tone I used for witnesses who were trying to evade direct questions. "He won't answer my calls," she said, stepping into the room without permission. "Ethan blocked me. His mother blocked me. Even the wedding planner blocked me." She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Can you believe that? The wedding planner." I waited. "You have to help me," Ashley said, moving closer to my desk. "You're the only one they like now. You're the golden girl. Thomas called you Your Honor. He respects you." She was talking faster now, the words tumbling over each other. "If you call him, if you just tell him that I'm sorry, that I was being stupid, that I was just scared and overwhelmed, he'll listen to you. He'll tell Ethan to take me back. I know he will." I stared at her. The sheer magnitude of her delusion was breathtaking. "Ashley," I said slowly, carefully enunciating each word. "Ethan did not leave you because of a misunderstanding. He left you because he realized who you are. He left me because you humiliated me," she flashed, a spark of the old anger flaring up before dying back down into desperation. "You made me look like a liar in front of everyone. You exposed me." "You are a liar," I said flatly. She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "You lied about my job. You lied to the caterer about the seating chart, using Thomas's name. You tried to manipulate a federal clerk into giving you protected information." I leaned forward slightly. "Those aren't misunderstandings, Ashley. Those are deliberate, calculated deceptions." "Okay, fine," she shouted, then immediately lowered her voice when she remembered where she was. "Fine. I lied. I made mistakes. But is that worth ending a marriage over? Is that worth ruining my entire life?" She took another step closer. "Rebecca, I'm 37 years old. I don't have a job. I gave up my apartment because I was moving into Ethan's condo. I have nowhere to go. Mom and Dad are furious with me. I have nothing." Her voice broke completely. "Please, please, just call Thomas. Tell him I'm your sister. Tell him family means something to you. Tell him whatever you have to tell him. Just fix this." I looked at the woman who had spent 2 years telling people I was a secretary. I looked at the woman who had tried to erase me from existence to secure her own status. And suddenly, I saw the pattern with perfect clarity. When Ashley failed at acting, she blamed the casting directors and asked our parents to pay her rent. When she failed at retail, she blamed the manager and asked our parents to buy her a car. When she failed at yoga instruction, she blamed the studio owner and asked our parents to co-sign a new lease. Now that she'd failed at the biggest con of her life, she wasn't looking for redemption. She wasn't looking to change or grow or take responsibility. She was looking for a new manager. She was looking for someone with more power than her to step in and bully reality back into a shape she could tolerate. "I'm not going to call Thomas," I said. "Rebecca!" she wailed, her voice rising dangerously. "I'm not going to call him," I repeated, "because this isn't fixable. What you did wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a pattern of manipulation and exploitation. Ethan doesn't need me to tell him anything. He saw it himself." I stood up, smoothing the front of my robe. "And here's the reality, Ashley. You're not looking for a sister right now. You're looking for an accomplice." She stared at me, tears streaming down her face. "You want me to use the credibility I earned with 30 years of hard work to underwrite your bad checks," I continued. "You want me to spend my reputation, my capital, to buy you an exit from the consequences of your own actions." I walked around the desk and stood in front of her. "I won't do it." Ashley looked at me, then at the judicial robes hanging on the coat rack in the corner, then at the stack of federal briefs on my desk. For the first time, she seemed to realize that the power I held wasn't something I could just lend her like a sweater. It was structural. It was part of me. It had been earned case by case, opinion by opinion, year by year. "You're letting me drown," she whispered. "No," I said. "You're standing in shallow water, Ashley. You just refuse to stand up." I turned back to my desk. "You should go. I have a docket to review." She stood there for another 10 seconds, radiating hatred and misery in equal measure. Then she turned and walked out. She didn't slam the door. She didn't have the energy for dramatics. She just faded away, like a signal losing strength. I sat back down and opened the case file. My hands were steady. On Friday evening, after I'd finally left Chambers and driven home through rush hour traffic, I found a letter in my mailbox. Not an email, an actual letter, handwritten on my mother's floral stationery, the kind she saved for thank you notes after funerals or weddings. I took it upstairs to my apartment, poured myself a glass of Pinot Noir, and sat on my sofa. The letter was 3 pages long, written in my mother's careful looping script. "Dearest Rebecca, we have been doing so much thinking since Saturday night. Your father and I were shocked by everything that happened. We had no idea you had risen so high in your field. A federal judge! We want you to know how incredibly proud we are of you." I stopped reading. I felt bile rise in my throat. "We always knew you were special. That was a lie. A blatant, transparent lie. They knew I was convenient. They knew I was low maintenance, that I didn't make demands, that I could be safely ignored. They didn't know I was special until Thomas Bradford told them I was." I took a long drink of wine and kept reading. To be a federal judge is such a distinction. We always saw something in you, even when you were quiet as a child. You were always so focused, so determined. We just didn't realize how far that determination would take you. We know things are strained with Ashley right now. She's in a very bad way. She's devastated, as you can imagine. She's lost Ethan, lost the wedding, lost her apartment. She's been staying with us, but it's been difficult. She cries constantly. We hope that in the spirit of family, you can find it in your heart to help smooth things over. The Bradfords clearly adore you. Thomas speaks so highly of you. If you could arrange a small lunch, just you, us, and Thomas, and perhaps Ethan, to show that there are no hard feelings, it would mean the world to your father. His blood pressure has been dangerously high since this all happened. The stress is affecting his health. We just want our family to be whole again. Please consider it. We love you so much. Mom and Dad." I dropped the letter on the coffee table and stared at it like it was a bomb that might detonate. Every sentence was carefully crafted. Every compliment was a Trojan horse with a request hidden inside. They didn't want to celebrate my success. They wanted to leverage it. They had lost their connection to the Bradford fortune through Ashley, so now they were trying to reroute the connection through me. They were trying to plug their social ambitions into my accomplishments. It was mercenary. It was cold. And somehow, it hurt more than Ashley's screaming. Ashley was a child throwing a tantrum, predictable, transparent. But my parents were adults. and they were negotiating a business deal using their own daughter's emotions as currency. I met Patricia for lunch on Saturday at a small Italian place near the river, far away from the ivory terrace and everything it represented. The restaurant was warm and loud in a comfortable way. Families with children, couples celebrating anniversaries, the clink of wine glasses, and genuine laughter. We sat in a corner booth. I ordered the risotto. Patricia ordered ossobuco. And when our food arrived, I pulled out my parents' letter and slid it across the table. Patricia put on her reading glasses and read it while eating, occasionally pausing to take a sip of Chianti. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with a napkin, removed her glasses, and looked at me over the rims. "Burn it," she said. "It's the first time they've ever told me they're proud of me," I said quietly. "It's counterfeit currency, Rebecca," Patricia said sharply. "They're not proud of you. They're proud of your proximity to Thomas Bradford." She took another sip of wine, her eyes never leaving mine. "If you were a federal judge in a district where nobody knew the Bradfords, they'd still be asking why you didn't marry a dentist and give them grandchildren." I picked at my risotto. "Do not let them negotiate with the truth," Patricia continued. "That's what they're doing. They're trying to trade a few cheap compliments for access to the Bradfords. And if you arrange that lunch, if you bring Thomas to the table, you're telling them that your dignity has a price." She leaned forward. "You're telling them that if they flatter you enough, praise you enough, guilt you enough, you'll let them use you, just like Ashley used you." I nodded slowly. I knew she was right. I'd known it the moment I'd read the letter. "I'm not going to answer," I said. "Good," Patricia replied. "Silence is the only language they understand." 10 days after the rehearsal dinner, my personal email pinged with a new message. It was an electronic invitation designed to look like a formal card. "Family Healing Dinner, hosted by Robert and Linda Hayes. This Sunday, 6 p.m. We're all hurting. We need to come together to heal. Please join us for a home-cooked meal. Ashley will be there. We want to start over. No guests, just family." I stared at the screen, reading it 3 times. It was a trap. I could see it as clearly as I could see a flawed argument in a legal brief. They wanted me in that room. They wanted to ambush me with tears and guilt, to gang up on me in the privacy of their own home where there were no federal judges to protect me, no witnesses to hold them accountable. They wanted to wear me down until I agreed to call Thomas, until I agreed to use my position to rehabilitate Ashley's reputation. They didn't want to heal. They wanted to recruit. The invitation had 3 RSVP options: yes, no, maybe. I moved my cursor over the buttons, hovering for a moment. Then I clicked the X in the corner. The invitation disappeared. I went to my trash folder and permanently deleted it from the server. I was done playing by their rules. I was done being the audience for their drama. I was the judge. And in my courtroom, when a case had no merit, you didn't schedule a hearing. You dismissed it with prejudice. 5 months passed. Winter gave way to spring, and spring to early summer. The trees outside the courthouse turned green, and the lake lost its coating of ice. Life continued with its usual rhythm. Cases argued, opinions written, justice dispensed in careful, measured doses. I had been nominated for the position of Chief Judge of the Great Lakes District. It was a promotion that usually took decades to secure, that required not just legal brilliance but unimpeachable character. The vetting process was exhaustive. The Department of Justice dug through every email I'd ever sent, every financial transaction I'd ever made, every association I'd ever held. In the final stage of confirmation, I needed letters of recommendation from the highest authorities in the circuit. I didn't have to ask for them. Patricia wrote a 3-page testament to my integrity that was so glowing it made me blush when I read it. She wrote about my clerkship, my years as a prosecutor, my 18 months on the bench. She wrote that I was the kind of jurist who makes you believe the system works. But the second letter came from a source that apparently silenced the entire confirmation committee. Thomas Bradford wrote a letter that was less recommendation and more decree. He wrote that in his 40 years on the bench, he had never met a jurist with a stronger moral compass. He wrote that my ability to separate personal tribulation from professional duty was not just admirable, it was essential for the future of the court. On a Tuesday afternoon, 2 days before the official announcement of my new title, I was called into a conference room at the courthouse. I expected to see the vetting committee, perhaps a final interview, a last round of questions. Instead, I found Thomas Bradford, Patricia Morgan, and a federal investigator named Agent Williams. And sitting in the corner, looking small and terrified, was Ashley. My stomach turned over. I hadn't spoken to my sister since she'd stood in my office 5 months ago, demanding I fix her life. I walked in slowly and took the empty seat next to Patricia. "What's going on?" I asked. Agent Williams slid a folder across the polished table toward me. "Judge Hayes, during our financial background check regarding your nomination, we flagged an irregularity." My heart began to pound. I opened the folder. Inside was a commercial lease agreement for a retail space in the most expensive shopping district in the city. Monthly rent, $12,000. The lease was for a boutique, high-end clothing apparently. It was signed by Ashley Hayes, but directly underneath her signature was a line for a guarantor. A guarantor is the person financially responsible if the tenant fails to pay. The name printed there was Judge Rebecca Hayes, and next to it was a signature that looked remarkably like mine, but with a slight hesitant tremor at the end of the Y, a tremor my signature never had. I stared at the document. The date was 2 weeks before the rehearsal dinner. "Ashley didn't just want the Bradford name for social clout," Thomas said, his voice rumbling from the end of the table. He was looking at my sister with an expression of profound disgust. "She needed the marriage to cover the debt she was about to drown in." I looked up at Ashley. She was refusing to make eye contact, picking at a loose thread on her sweater. "You forged my signature," I said. The words came out as a whisper, but in the acoustic perfection of the conference room, they sounded like a scream. Ashley flinched. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she mumbled. "I was going to pay it back. Once I married Ethan, once I had access to the joint accounts, I was going to pay the whole year up front. You would never have known." I felt a coldness spread through my chest that was so absolute it was almost numbing. She had leveraged my name. She had leveraged my title, my career, my reputation, my freedom. If this lease had defaulted, the creditors would have come after a sitting federal judge. I would have been investigated for fraud. I could have been disbarred, removed from the bench, possibly even prosecuted. "You were willing to destroy my life," I said slowly. "Everything I worked for, just so you could open a dress shop you couldn't afford." "I just wanted to be something," Ashley shouted, her head snapping up. Her eyes were wet, but they weren't sad. They were angry. "You have everything, Rebecca. The title, the respect, the money, the power. I just wanted one thing that was mine." She stood up, her voice rising dangerously. "I knew you wouldn't sign it if I asked you because you're so stingy with your help. You've always been stingy, so I did what I had to do." Thomas slammed his hand down on the table. The sound was like a gunshot. Ashley jumped and immediately sat back down. "Enough!" Thomas roared. His face was flushed with anger. "This is not about your sister's generosity. This is about a felony. Forgery is a felony. Fraud is a felony. Identity theft is a felony." He stood up, his full height towering over the table. He walked over to where Ashley was sitting and leaned down, his face inches from hers. "I did some digging of my own, young lady," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "I found out that you also applied for 3 credit cards using the Bradford family trust address as your residence. This was before you were even married. You were building a house of cards on a foundation of theft." He straightened up. "My house is not a shield for your lies, and neither is this courthouse." Ashley looked around wildly, at Agent Williams, at Patricia, at me. The reality of the situation was finally piercing her delusion. This wasn't a family squabble. This was a criminal investigation. "Rebecca," she whimpered, her voice shifting instantly to pleading. "Rebecca, please tell them. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them we talked about it, that I had verbal permission." I stared at her. "Please," she begged, tears spilling down her cheeks. "If you just sign a statement saying you gave me permission to use your name, that it was a family arrangement, they'll drop it. You're the chief judge now. They'll listen to you." Her voice broke completely. "Please, I'm your sister. I don't want to go to jail. The room waited. Patricia looked at me, her face impassive, but her eyes communicating clearly. This is your choice. No one will judge you either way. Thomas watched me with intense interest. Agent Williams had his pen poised over his notebook. They were waiting to see if I would revert. Waiting to see if the old Rebecca, the one who cleaned up messes, who stayed in the shadows, who protected the golden child no matter the cost, would step forward one last time. I looked at the forged signature. I looked at the lease agreement. I looked at my sister's face. In her eyes, I didn't see love. I didn't see remorse. I saw calculation. She was calculating the odds of my compliance. She was banking on guilt, on family loyalty, on the fact that I'd always been the tool she used to fix her life. I realized then that she didn't see me as a person. She saw me as a resource, an ATM, a liability shield, a character witness, anything she needed me to be, except her sister. I took a deep breath. No, I said. Ashley froze. What? I turned to Agent Williams, meeting his eyes directly. I did not sign that document, Agent Williams. I did not authorize it. I had no knowledge of it until this moment. Rebecca! Ashley screamed. She stood up, reaching across the table. You can't do this! You're sending me to prison! I stood up too. I was taller than her in my heels, stronger than her in my conviction. I'm not sending you anywhere, Ashley, I said, my voice calm as frozen lake water. You sent yourself there the moment you picked up that pen. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But we're family, she finally managed. You're supposed to help me. I looked at her, and I felt the final severance of the cord that had bound us for 39 years. You still only see me as a tool, Ashley, I said quietly. You see my robe as a blanket to cover your mistakes. You see my gavel as a weapon to fight your battles. I picked up the folder and handed it back to Agent Williams. I resigned from that role. I'm not your tool. I am a judge, and I'm done being an accessory to your life. Agent Williams stood up. Ms. Hayes, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me. Ashley was sobbing now, loud, ugly, terrified sobs. She looked at Thomas, but he had turned his back. She looked at Patricia, but Patricia was studying the ceiling with great interest. She looked at me one last time as Agent Williams took her arm. I hate you, she screamed as they led her toward the door. I hate you! I hate you! The door closed. The silence returned. I sat back down, my hands trembling slightly. Just a little. Patricia reached over and covered my hand with hers. That was the hardest ruling you'll ever make, she said softly. I nodded. Yes, it was. Thomas turned around. He looked at me with solemn, profound pride. It was also the most just, he said. 3 days later, the investiture ceremony took place in the Grand Hall of the Great Lakes Courthouse. The room was a cavern of marble and history, built in the 1920s when courthouses were designed to inspire awe. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like snow. The gallery was packed. Every judge in the district was there in their black robes. The mayor was there. The legal elite of the city were there. I stood at the podium, my hand resting on the Bible that Patricia held for me. I could feel the weight of the new robe on my shoulders, heavier than my regular judicial robe, with extra fabric and brocade marking the position of chief judge. It was heavy, but it was a good weight. The weight of responsibility, not the weight of expectation. My parents were there. They sat in the second row, looking older and smaller than I remembered. They had tried to call me after Ashley's arrest, but I had directed them to Ashley's public defender. They sat quietly now, watching the ceremony with a mixture of awe and fear. They finally understood that the power in this room didn't belong to the people they wanted to impress. It belonged to the daughter they had ignored. As I finished reciting the oath, the room erupted in applause. It was a thunderous sound, a wave of validation that washed over me. I looked out at the sea of faces, my clerks beaming with pride, colleagues who had read my opinions and respected my mind, the community I had built brick by brick through hard work and honesty. Then I saw movement at the very back of the hall. The heavy oak doors opened slightly. A figure was standing there, backlit by the hallway lights. It was Ashley. She was out on bail, awaiting her preliminary hearing. She was wearing a subdued gray dress, trying to look modest and chastened. She took a step into the room, looking around for a way in, for a place to stand. She was looking to be seen, to catch a stray beam of the spotlight, to tell someone near her, "That's my sister." She took another step forward, rising on her tiptoes, trying to find an opening in the crowd, but the room was too full. The wall of black robes, the wall of suits and formal dresses, the wall of people who knew the truth. It was impenetrable. No one moved to let her in. No one turned to acknowledge her. The collective back of the room was turned against her, not out of cruelty, but out of simple truth. She didn't belong here. Ashley stopped. She stood there for a long moment, looking at me on the dais, bathed in light, surrounded by respect and accomplishment, and I saw the moment she finally realized it. She couldn't touch me anymore. She couldn't claim me. She couldn't use me. She was on the outside, looking in through a window she herself had shattered. Slowly, she turned around. The doors closed behind her with a soft click, and she disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. I looked away from the doors and turned to the people on the stage. Thomas Bradford stepped forward. He was wearing his own judicial robe, looking like a lion in winter, silver-maned and powerful. He extended his hand. "Congratulations, Your Honor," he said, his voice warm. He held my hand for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes bright and kind. "Welcome home, Rebecca." I looked at him. I looked at Patricia, who was wiping a tear from the corner of her eye. I looked at the colleagues who were standing and cheering, at Andrew, who was beaming like a proud parent, at the community I had earned through merit and integrity. I realized then that for 39 years, I had been looking for family in the wrong place. I had been looking for it in biology, in shared DNA and shared history. But family isn't blood. Family isn't the people who share your last name or your childhood address. Family are the people who stand with you when the truth makes the room go silent. Family are the people who don't ask you to shrink so they can feel big. Family are the people who look at your integrity and say, "I recognize that." I squeezed Thomas's hand. "Thank you, Judge Bradford." I turned back to the room, raised my head high, and smiled, a real smile, not the careful, controlled expression I usually wore. The gavel banged, a sharp crack that echoed through the marble hall, sealing the moment in the record forever. The verdict was finally, perfectly, in my favor. My new chambers as chief judge were in the corner of the building, with windows that looked out over the lake. It was early morning, and the water was calm, reflecting the sky like polished glass. I had been in the position for a year now. It had been challenging, more administrative work than I'd anticipated, more politics, more compromise. But I loved it. I loved the responsibility, the weight of shaping policy, of mentoring younger judges, of leaving my mark on the system I'd devoted my life to. My phone buzzed. A text from Patricia. "Dinner tonight? That new French place?" I smiled and texted back. "Can't. Thomas invited me to Sunday dinner at his house. Victoria insists I need to try her pot roast." Patricia's response came immediately. "You're officially adopted then. Say hi to Thomas for me." I set the phone down and looked around my office. On the walls were framed opinions I'd written, certificates of achievement, photos from judicial conferences. On my desk was a picture from last month. Me, Patricia, and Thomas at a bar association event. All three of us in our robes, laughing at something someone had said off camera. There were no photos of Ashley, no photos of my parents. I had spoken to my mother once in the past year, a brief phone call where she'd asked if I could help with Ashley's legal fees. I had politely declined and referred her to the public defender's office. Ashley had taken a plea deal, 3 years probation, community service, and restitution. No prison time, but a felony conviction that would follow her forever. My parents had stopped calling after that. I had heard through distant relatives that they'd moved to Arizona to be closer to my mother's sister. A fresh start, apparently. I didn't miss them. There was a knock on my door. Andrew poked his head in. "Judge Hayes, the Martinez hearing is ready. They're waiting for you in courtroom 3. "Thank you, Andrew. I'll be right there." I stood and straightened my robe, the heavy one with the extra panels that marked me as chief judge. I picked up the case file for Martinez and walked to the door. As I walked down the hallway toward the courtroom, other judges and clerks nodded respectfully. A young law clerk I didn't recognize stared at me with wide eyes, then quickly looked away, intimidated. I remembered being that clerk, young, uncertain, terrified of my own shadow. I smiled at her as I passed. She looked shocked, then smiled back tentatively. The courtroom doors opened. "All rise," the bailiff announced. "The Honorable Chief Judge Rebecca Hayes presiding." I walked to the bench, my robes flowing behind me. The courtroom was full, attorneys, defendants, family members in the gallery. I sat down in the high-backed chair, arranged my materials, and picked up the gavel. For a moment, I paused. I thought about the text message from Ashley that had started all of this. "Don't come. You'll embarrass me." I thought about how afraid I'd been of making her uncomfortable, of taking up space, of being seen. And I thought about where I was now, presiding over a courtroom, respected by my peers, part of a chosen family that valued truth over performance. I brought the gavel down once, the sound echoing through the room. "Court is in session," I said clearly. "Let's begin." And we did.